This is the Second World War as it has rarely been seen, filmed by ordinary men for their home movies. Despite Nazi control, amateur film was as widely used in Germany as it was in Britain. Remarkably, a handful of British and German soldiers took their cine cameras with them to the front lines. In the early days of the war, they filmed their comrades alongside the people that they had conquered.
Poland was the country where many of the so-called Eastern Jews lived. So he filmed them as if they were a tourist attraction.
But from Europe to the Far East, as the conflict escalated, some of these amateur cameramen on both sides filmed the war in all its horror.
He filmed D-Day itself. He was actually in the first wave.
This is a story of a few of these filmmakers and how they filmed everyday life during wartime, capturing love and loss, life and death, victory and defeat. These are some of the early films made by Derek Brown, who filmed his time as a soldier during the war. In the 1930s, amateur filmmaking was an unusual hobby.
I suppose I started making films round about the age of 13, when I got my first cine camera. I had the idea of making a film which involved a smash and grab raid. We arranged for one of my friends to come up to the jeweler's shop and throw a brick through the window, except he didn't throw the brick through the window. We were a little bit terrified in case the police saw us.
This is Paul Kellermann, a young German filmmaker living in Cologne, capturing a life as yet untroubled by war. Inspired by his films, Paul's niece, Hiltrude, has become the family historian.
I
first got to know him through watching his films. He was filming in 1936, which was quite special, you know, quite unusual then. The Christmas films are beautiful, but the films about the war are the most interesting and moving.
Paul Kellermann and Derek Brown are two of a few men on both sides who took their cine cameras with them to the front. It's through their ingenuity that we're able to witness the experiences of war in this uniquely personal way.
What is the absolute sort of revelation, really, of these amateur collections that we now have is they have an honesty about them that is purely to do with the vision of the filmmaker behind the camera. It wasn't to do with propaganda. They weren't always planned. They were just spontaneous of the moment. So when your community goes into revolution, which is, you know, what happened when your world is completely changed, what better subject matter for a filmmaker to take? And I think how significant and important that contribution is to the history of the Second World War.
On September the 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Klaus Esmann was an airman in the Luftwaffe. He was also an amateur filmmaker for whom capturing day-to-day life was a passionate hobby. He filmed the invasion both on the ground and from the air.
He was trained as an aerial observer, so photography was an integral part of his job.
Als der Krieg ausbrach,
He made films of his campaigns during the war.
Einsätzen Filme gemacht. Ich glaube, das war sein Interesse.
I think that he was interested in showing my mother images from Poland.
Seiner Frau auch zeigen wollte. Und hatte ja keine wirklichen
He had no personal experience of what Poland and Polish people were like.
aussah oder wie es wirklich in Polen aussah. Aber war eben vorprogrammiert.
He was influenced by propaganda in terms of what to think about Poland.
Polen war nun eben das Land, in dem sich viele...
Poland was a country where many so-called Eastern Jews lived. And of course, they'd been depicted in a particular way in the Nazi press. So we filmed them as if they were a tourist attraction.
Als touristische Attraktion fotografiert.
Up to the very last, it would have been quite possible to have arranged a peaceful and honourable settlement between Germany and Poland. But Hitler would not have it.
With the outbreak of war, many men in Britain enlisted in the military. Amongst those to sign up was Leslie Fowler, a keen amateur filmmaker from Hertfordshire. His son Robin, seen here as a young boy, has researched his father's wartime experiences.
He went to join up with the Navy. He did it because he had heard Chamberlain's broadcast saying that this country was now at war with Germany. And the alternative seemed to be that he was going to be dominated by somebody else. And he didn't want that. So he said, well, it has to be fought. I'm going to have to do something about it. So off he went and did. A lot of holding camps ensued where they were trained to get fit and have some durability to them, mainly to be used in long hours spent on the bridge standing up, trying to keep awake.
Derek Brown had enlisted in the Territorial Army in April 1939. He was on holiday with his family when he was called up.
We were finished with our training for the summer, and I joined my parents in Scotland. And while I was there, I met a girl and was very friendly with her throughout that time. But at the end of 10 days, I got a telegram calling me back to my unit. And from then on, I was in the army.
Derek Brown might have been in the army, but the 8 months following the outbreak of war were marked by an absence of British military operations. The period became known in Britain as the Phony War. Posted outside a small town in County Durham, he filmed the monotony of life in the searchlights.
For weeks on end, we were virtually confined to sight. The YMCA used to run a tea van. This was the highlight of the week. This used to call round the sites and provide luxuries like chocolate, cigarettes, stamps, letters, the sort of things that people need just to make life a little more bearable.
As both sides expanded their armed services through conscription, the war turned civilians into soldiers. In Germany, amateur filmmaker Paul Kellermann, seen here in his own film, was conscripted into an artillery observation unit.
Paul
rose to the rank of lieutenant. In relation to how much time he spent in the army, this wasn't a great achievement. I feel that it wasn't important for him and that he was just more interested in filmmaking. So it really suited him that he was posted in an observation unit and not right at the front.
Besser an der Front hätte das ja gar nicht gekonnt.
The military in Germany at that time was a drafted army. That means many men were made soldiers who actually did not like to become soldiers. The perfect soldier and the perfect man would certainly be that one who was ready to sacrifice his life on behalf of his country. But the military also needed to include those men who may not have been the perfect soldiers. Just by being good socializers, were considered as true men as well, or got their place.
From May 1940, the pace of war quickened as Germany began its invasion of Holland, Belgium and France. Paul Kellermann recorded his comrades' departure from loved ones and their advance. Always on the move, his films give a sense of the relentless pace of this offensive.
Die Filme von Frankreich sind von daher interessant, weil
The films from France are really interesting because you can see the type of troops that the French sent into battle.
ins Feld geschickt haben. Man sieht da teilweise
You can see that the prisoners of war are, to a great extent, Moroccan.
Marokkaner oder
Many of them appear to be colonial troops conscripted from Africa.
die dann aus Afrika irgendwo verpflichtet wurden. Mich haben da sehr diese
I was very moved by the defeated troops marching through the streets.
da an der Straße entlang gingen. Die vielen toten Pferde.
The footage of the dead horses I found particularly terrible because it shows such wanton destruction, a senseless waste of life. These are animals that didn't have anything to do with it.
Die also wirklich nichts damit zu tun haben.
There is more German film of frontline activity shot by amateur cameramen than there is shot by British cameramen. Filming was an integral part of German society, amateur filming was, and in some instances the commanders of units more or less appointed soldiers within their unit as an official, semi-official unit cameraman. A second reason would be that the start of the war, the Germans were advancing. There were fewer security concerns in the minds of the Germans than there were in their struggling British counterparts.
It never really occurred to me that there was anything very wrong in taking films of the domestic arrangements, but I did take great care never to show any equipment, the searchlight sight, the sound locator, or anything like that. At that time, security was uppermost in almost everybody's mind. There were all sorts of campaigns, advertising campaigns, to remind people that careless talk costs lives. Because this was just about the time of Dunkirk, and we were expecting something of an invasion almost any day.
In this atmosphere of caution, amateur filmmakers like Derek Brown avoided recording military facilities. Instead, they filmed the public activities of the Home Guard as it prepared for a possible invasion.
There were lots of amateur filmmakers at the time who took on those filmmaking skills that they had in order to promote war work. For example, the Second World War Home Guard movies. There are a number of those which show and promote the work of the Home Guard and the ARP. Also training films, instructional films that have been made by amateurs to say, this is what our community's doing, let's carry on doing it. It was motivational in that way. It was sort of propaganda, but on a domestic community scale.
The threat of invasion seemed to many to be very real. By this time, Germany had the whole of France under its control. Paul Kellermann drove into an occupied Paris in mid-June 1940, just over a month after the German offensive had begun.
Wenn man diese Filme so sieht, teilweise, dann glaubt man gar nicht, dass sich das...
When you watch these films, you can't believe that they're at war because you can see just how relaxed they are.
Wie die da vorgehen. Paul rasiert
There's
sich
Paul
gerade.
shaving.
Konnte sich wirklich gut in Szene setzen.
He really knew how to pose.
Es ist wie im Zeltlager.
It's like they're camping, playing, reading the newspaper, writing letters. What a group of men would do together anyway. It's such a comfortable atmosphere. Pin-up girls there, just what a chap needs.
Ja, sowas brauchte man dann auch.
Für mich immer wieder erstaunlich, was gefilmt wurde. Es war Soldaten.
I find what was filmed absolutely astonishing. Soldiers were banned from filming frontline fighting, so instead, they mostly filmed personal activities. Particularly with the French campaign, it comes across like a scout camp. The images give the message that everything is still okay for us soldiers.
Uns geht's ja noch gut.
After the surrender of France in June 1940, Germany used French airfields as bases from which to stage bombing raids on Britain. Theodor Plurter worked as Luftwaffe ground crew, preparing planes for raids on cities such as Plymouth and Bristol.
Zwischen Lisieux und Caen haben wir gelegen in Normandie.
We were based in an airfield in Normandy, between Lisieux and Caen, and from there we flew the Stukas into England.
Nach England Einsätze geflogen. Unsere Aufgabe bestand darin, die
Our job was to load the bombs onto the planes, sometimes as much as 8 times a day. The planes would be away for up to an hour and a half. Then when they came back, they'd be loaded again, and there would be more flight talks and so on.
Ich habe praktisch das Leben auf den Flugplätzen gefilmt.
I filmed life in the airfield. I didn't have any problems doing this.
Immer wieder, dass einige Leute Schwierigkeit hatten.
You did hear again and again that some people were not allowed to film, but I filmed everywhere that I wanted to film. I was never criticized for doing this. I could film aircraft, detonators, bombs. No one said anything.
Hat nie jemand was gesagt.
You see life and work in the airfields, how the planes were serviced by the technicians. We saw how the planes returned, badly shot up, but still managing to land safely, as well as planes that were shot down, some with the entire undercarriage blown away.
Das Leitwerk weggeschossen wurde.
By the autumn of 1940, German air attacks on Britain were targeting major industrial and population centres. Martin Davis was one of the millions on the receiving end of these raids. Working as an ambulance man in London, he experienced the Blitz firsthand.
Speaking of it now, people will say, weren't you dead frightened all the time? Well, no, you weren't, you know, except at rare moments when something really big had happened. But you get used to that life. You're living in a war, damn it. And you know, it's for months on end, so you just adapt to that. But I can remember once the phone went, and it was my sister, who lived in Welwyn Garden City, 20 miles north of London. And she said, I'm terribly sorry, I've got bad news for you. Mum died in hospital this morning. And there I was in the middle of an air raid with bombs going on outside, you see. And of course, chaps in there, my friends, couldn't help overhearing this. So I got a lot of sympathy and feedback and so on, but it was a tricky time. And I couldn't even go out and go to see her or my sister for the moment because I was stuck there.
Martin Davis worked in one of many rest centres set up to look after people whose homes had been destroyed.
Well, what they did was to come to us, so they were brought to us by wardens. On the whole, they weren't much injured because the injured ones had been taken off to hospital or the cemetery. But the ones who came to us were on the whole in one piece, and generally they came with their parents and a couple of kids, or usually the mother, because of course the pa was probably off in the war somewhere.
Davis was one of those men who had not gone off to war. He was a conscientious objector, working instead with the Friends Ambulance Unit.
If you decided you weren't going to blooming well join up, which of course everyone thought you would do, you had to register as a conscientious objector. But registering wasn't enough. You had then to go through a sort of trial, a tribunal, questionnaire, which I did. We all did. And there was a judge or somebody sitting up there firing questions at me and saying, what do you mean? This is ridiculous. What do you mean you won't go to war? Can't you see the Germans are there facing us and we've got to do something about it? I could see that Hitler was really up to no good, that he had in mind to attack this country. And it's very difficult to argue logically against that. But if you have this overriding feeling that to put a gun up and shoot another human being is wrong, you know, that overrides all that. And in the end, they went away and quietly discussed it, came back and said, okay, Mr. Davis, as long as you continue with your idea of joining the Friends Ambulance Unit, we're not giving you complete exemption from military service, only on condition that you go on with the Friends Ambulance Unit work.
In Britain, individual men were able to opt out of combat on religious or moral grounds. This was not the case in Germany.
In Germany, it was always the group that was glorified. The group was the only thing that matters. And what does that mean? It means that you had, as an individual, to switch off any kind of thoughts of individual, personal visions of life, career, whatsoever, family. It no longer mattered. Your individual visions did no longer matter. And your individual responsibility did no longer matter.
By the end of 1940, with much of Northern Europe under its control, the official mood in Germany was celebratory. This amateur footage shows Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi Minister for Propaganda, on the right, on a visit to Munster that year. Goebbels was the architect of the state newsreels that announced Germany's triumphs to its people and dramatically promoted the Third Reich as it wished to be seen.
He took a very, very close interest in the construction and editing of the German newsreels. These are not only German newsreels designed for screening within Germany, but also throughout occupied and neutral Europe. At one stage, German newsreels were being shown in 17 different languages in 37 different territories.
In Britain, there was nothing of comparable scope being produced on film.
There was a natural British diffidence, I think, to the notion of publicity. There was, of course, a different reason why publicity was not so welcome at that time, and that was after the brief spell of the phony war, British forces were driven out of Europe.
The British retreat from Europe prompted calls to somehow boost morale at home. In an attempt to improve the situation, the War Office recruited its first civilian publicity officer. Ronald Tritton believed that the most effective way of improving morale lay in the use of cinefilm.
What happened was that we managed to capture some German newsreel stuff. Tritton put this together in a screening and called together the top military people and showed them the type of work that the Germans were putting together and the type of propaganda that they were feeding to their people and to the news worldwide. And this was a deliberate attempt to change the minds of the military.
Tritton's film was a success. It convinced military leaders of the need to produce high-quality film footage promoting British military efforts to rival that being produced by Germany. The result was the creation of a new Army Film and Photographic Unit, or AFPU. Unlike the previous Army Film Unit that recruited from within the film industry, the AFPU recruited directly from the Army, training soldiers with any previous experience of photography or film to capture frontline action on camera.
Cameramen in general were used to working in a closed environment with 3 or 4 assistants around them, and that wasn't the type of cameraman that would do a good job whilst the enemy are shooting at him. They preferred soldiers with cameras rather than cameramen as soldiers. What happened was, on the notice boards in every army unit throughout the United Kingdom, anyone with photographic or film experience was asked would they like to join a new thing called the Army Film Unit.
One person who applied was conscripted soldier Harry Oakes.
I was a parachutist before I was in the Army Film Unit. A lot had no knowledge of photography, and one chap had his own photographic shop. But nevertheless, no one really knew much about filming. It was rather rare, I think, in those days for people to have a cine camera, even an 8mm one.
After initial film training, these new cameramen were attached to military units. To begin with, they got a mixed reception.
It's just on one occasion, though, there was some dissent. This brigadier, he saw me with this camera and said, "We want people with rifles and bayonets, not bloody cameras, you know." But generally speaking, it wasn't like that at all. We got well received.
A defining moment for both the British military and its new Army Film Unit came in the autumn of 1942. The 8th Army, under the command of Montgomery, defeated Rommel's Afrika Korps at El Alamein in the North African desert. From coverage of this campaign, the AFPU produced Desert Victory, a feature-length documentary that charted the first major Allied victory of the war.
It was a significant film because it was a significant turning point in the war, and certainly in terms of put together and the skill that was used to put it together. It was a tremendous piece of work. I would say that was the takeoff point for the AFPU.
The Allied campaign in North Africa relied heavily on support from colonial troops. In 1942, Derek Brown had been reassigned from his searchlight unit in Britain and posted to northwest India in order to train Indian Army recruits for the North African offensive.
Well, it was our first experience of life overseas and our first experience, really, of living in a hot country. So we were all kitted up with pith helmets and shorts.
Derek Brown's passion for filmmaking went with him, but unfortunately he'd left his camera at home.
Our one day out there used to be a Saturday, and we would take a tonga down into the village, and there we would wander around the bazaar. While I was there, I found myself an old 16mm camera, and I was able to get it for 200 rupees.
Victory in North Africa meant that Derek Brown was redeployed yet again, this time to support a renewed Allied offensive against the Japanese in Burma. He was sent to shore up the supply route over the India-Burma border and used his camera to film the remnants of the previous Allied campaign.
When we got there, we found that there was a very poor road, and it was littered, absolutely littered, with broken down vehicles and smashed vehicles, all of which had been used by those who'd escaped from Burma from the Japanese advance and come to grief in one way and another on the road.
These vehicles were the remains of the Allied retreat from Burma in May 1942. One of the many people caught up in the chaos of the withdrawal was conscientious objector Martin Davis, seen here in amateur footage shot in China. He had travelled to the Far East with the Friends Ambulance Unit to help wounded Chinese troops and civilians in the war with Japan.
We weren't part of the war, except that we were there to help the chaps who were fighting it. But they probably faced more danger than a lot of the chaps in the army did. And that's what I wanted. I didn't mind that.
Despite Allied support, China was fighting a losing battle against the Japanese. The Allies were forced to retreat across the border into Burma, where the Friends Ambulance Unit helped to re-establish a field hospital.
Our first stop, actually, when we came down from the north, was Pinmanar. That was where we met up with a civilian doctor who was a missionary. We went down to meet him and to help him because he had the nurses, he had the medical knowledge, he had everything we needed. Didn't have any transport. And that's just what we could do. We had the transport. The Japanese were advancing towards, so we were told we'd have to move, have to go back, find another base, another site to operate from. So we did. We loaded the nurses and the gear and everything into the lorries and set off up north to see where else we could set up hospital. And we did this about 4 times.
North of Mandalay, they met with the command of General Joseph Stilwell, the American Commander-in-Chief for China and Burma. With the Japanese barely 20 miles away, they began their retreat from Burma, driving through the jungle towards India until the road gave out. Martin Davis photographed their escape.
There we were, the 114 or what it was of us, waiting for orders. At that point, Stilwell collected us all together in a group in a jungle and gave us a little pep talk. This is where you are, you've got to get out. And we're all together, if you don't want to go, stay behind, look after yourself. That was the general message. The actual walk took 2 weeks and something, sleeping in the rough, eating off the land. But we knew we had to get our skates on and get to India.
The strange party of refugees spent 2 weeks on foot, struggling through dense rainforest with the Japanese in hot pursuit.
I was walking along behind these two Americans, expecting to meet the Japanese around the corner. I'm not sure we were fearful exactly, we weren't exactly quaking, but you knew what was likely to happen, what was possibly going to happen. And I said in my conversation with Tom Owen, Tom said to me, "You know, Martin, if I had a Tommy gun with me now, I might just ditch my pacifist principles and use it. What do you think?" And I said, "You may be right, Tom. I hope we're not put in that position, though."
On the 20th of May, 1942, the exhausted party crossed over the North India border at Imphal, reaching safety. Martin Davis photographed his last view back into Burma. The Germans had been fighting a long and arduous battle of their own. In June 1941, Hitler had broken his pact with Stalin, and Germany invaded the Soviet Union. As German forces advanced rapidly east, behind their front lines, paramilitary death squads began the systematic killing of opponents. One execution of Jewish prisoners was witnessed by a German sailor and amateur cameraman, Reinhard Wiener. It took place in August 1941, near Libau in Latvia. Though hundreds of thousands died in this way, this is the only film record of these massacres. As the German advance confronted the Red Army in the autumn and winter of 1941, Paul Kellermann filmed the increasingly harsh conditions. His niece, Hiltrude, has the archive of his time in Russia.
Der Russland-Film ist sehr erschütternd.
The film from Russia is really upsetting.
Hatte Briefwechsel mit
He exchanged letters with his mother, 18 in total.
geschrieben worden.
Dear Mother, the advance has been going well. We're 150 kilometres further towards Moscow. The panzers are ahead of us, and the planes have been taking care of the rest. Around us, we can see so much destruction as we pass by. The food isn't great, but as long as we have potatoes, salt and fish, it's okay. Dear Mother, this is the worst that I've seen it since the war started. It really is a battlefield. We've buried 17 dead today. Thousands of refugees pass us by. Dear Mother, the winter is passing slowly. I can't wait for spring. The truck engines are dead, and everything has been transferred to horse and sleigh. As an observer, I have to do everything on foot. When I'm using my equipment, my eyebrows freeze to the glass, my cheeks burn, and the snow and wind sting my eyes. My fingertips become hard and lifeless, even though I'm wearing double gloves, and the end of my nose turns white despite me rubbing it. It's constantly backwards and forwards, advancing and retreating. Everyone has had enough of this. Lucky those who are wounded and at home, out of the war and safe on leave. At some point, this has to end. With this in mind, all my love, Paul.
This was the last letter he ever wrote.
There were some Russian partisans, snipers, who ambushed him and shot him dead. He died on February the 2nd, 1942. By the middle of March, his mother had still not been informed, and she was still writing him letters. She wished him a happy 27th birthday, which he didn't make.
In July 1942, 5 months after Paul Kellermann's death, the German army attacked the Russians at Stalingrad. With combined casualties of more than 1.5 million, it was to become one of the most brutal battles of the Second World War. Klaus Esmann's father, an aerial observer with a bomber crew, was shot down during a raid over the city. He had flown nearly 100 similar raids.
Wir haben eine ziemlich genaue Schilderung.
We have quite a precise description from the signalman who was in the same plane as my father. He wrote a letter to my mother describing the last offensive that they flew together.
Dem letzten Einsatz, den mein Vater geflogen ist. Plötzlich näherten sich uns 4 Jäger.
Suddenly, 4 fighters came into view. I could tell that they were the enemy and opened fire.
Unser Leerradrechter Tank wurde getroffen.
The fighters hit one of our fuel tanks, which exploded and burned. Then, the right wing broke off, which sent the plane into a tumble. At that point, the captain shouted to everyone on board to get out. I landed by parachute 2 kilometers west of Orlovka, a small village on the way to Stalingrad. If he did die in the crash, then think of it as the most beautiful death and be comforted. It is not a bad thing. One only thinks of one's duty to one's home country, the beautiful fatherland for which we will joyfully give our lives anytime.
Und freudig unser Leben geben. Als ich das zum ersten Mal wirklich bewusst gelesen habe, hat es mir richtig Angst.
When I read this for the first time, it really filled me with angst. These hollow phrases like the most beautiful death, they mean nothing to me. That these people believed in these things, I just can't understand it.
Das kann vielleicht nur jemand verstehen, der
Maybe only those who grew up in such circumstances could understand. How can you try to give comfort in this way to a woman who has just lost her husband? It's incomprehensible to me.
Völlig unbegreiflich.
The scale of the German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943 marked a turning point in the German advance on the Eastern Front. Over the course of that year, the Nazis were forced into a retreat. In the West, Allied bombing raids on German cities intensified. In July of 1943, they launched a massive assault on Hamburg. The bombing was so intense that it created a firestorm, incinerating some 8 square miles of the city. Hans Brunswick, who worked for the fire service, captured it on film.
I was in Hamburg at the time of the big bombing raid in 1943. I'd been in the fire brigade 5 years by then. There was no talk of a raid on Hamburg. And then About half an hour after the air raid alarm, there came a dreadful bombardment on our neighborhood. We were in shock. We heard nothing but the firestorm. It was a great roar. You could see the trees bend with the heat.
Sonst in der Hauptfeuerwache selbst hat man von dem Sturm nichts bemerkt, aber so wie man
As soon as you went out of the doors, out of the fire station doors, you were almost blown over by the storm.
fast umgerissen, so gewaltig war.
It was that powerful.
Diese Tankstelle haben wir auch gefunden.
We found this petrol station. It was situated in the middle of the flattened area, but the whole workforce who belonged to it lay dead around the petrol station.
Auf dem Wege zu dieser Tankstelle habe ich
On the way to the petrol station, I saw thousands, not hundreds, but thousands of dead bodies which lay in great piles. And I took some film of these bodies.
von diesen Leichen. Ich muss
I must say that after about the 10th picture, I couldn't photograph anymore. You couldn't do it. It was too much to take.
schwer zu ertragen. Das ist eines der
It's a picture you don't forget your whole life long.
The bombing of German cities continued throughout 1944, and as the Soviets forced a retreat in the east, the Western Allies launched the invasion of German-occupied France on June the 6th. Leslie Fowler was the captain of a landing craft. Years later, he recounted the build-up to D-Day to his son, Robin.
D-Day itself was delayed for 24 hours. They're all keyed up, ready to go, and yes, if they could have a swim, why not? It's a way to let off steam, as it were, and relax a bit before you have to key yourself up.
Fowler was transporting troops and equipment from ships onto the beaches. Remarkably, he filmed the events of D-Day as they unfolded.
He was taking them in. He was actually in the first wave. He was down on Utah Beach first, and after that first wave landing, went up to join the British forces at Sword area and did the ferrying of the infantry across from there. There is a shot of him offloading what I believe is the 51st Highland Division on a very flat beach, and they all had to wade ashore. Apologised, of course, that he couldn't get them any closer, but the commanding officer said, "Right, lads," and took his trousers off and his boots, slung them over his shoulder, and waded off, and the rest of his platoon followed him. They did all sorts of work jobs, ferrying backwards and forwards, and he did film one such offloading when they had their own deck full of stretcher cases And they're being winched up onto this venerable-looking hospital ship with its red crosses on it. Poor devils, he said, they thought they were going home and that they were out of the war now and safe. But the ship struck a mine and went down with all hands.
As the Western Allies advanced through France, the reality of war was filmed by an American serviceman. Paris was liberated in August. But there would be another year of fierce fighting across Europe before Germany would surrender. On the 15th of April 1945, British troops came upon a camp at Bergen-Belsen in the northwest of Germany. During its liberation, the camp was extensively filmed by the Army Film and Photographic Unit.
This was something which had to be documented. Cameramen in the British Army were essentially fulfilling two purposes. They were filming for a historic record and also for publicity purposes. This was absolutely essential that it be recorded for all time.
AFPU cameraman Harry Oakes, seen here in the middle of the group, was amongst the first Allied troops to come upon the camp.
I mean, it's awful, really. I think you can get used to seeing corpses, but one did. And the Germans used to have the job of putting the corpses in the pit. And what was even worse is the two or three would have to get inside this big pit and make it level, because all the corpses were piling up on the side.
You remember filming the children that you found alive at Belsen?
Yes, I do, yes. They're extraordinarily brave, I felt. Extraordinarily brave. They got past the crying stage. They said we looked quite numb.
Victory in Europe was declared in May 1945. Britain celebrated with street parties, caught on camera by newsreels and amateurs alike. Yet the amateur films of men like Leslie Fowler, still serving on the front lines, paint a different picture, showing VE Day as just another day, endured in a foreign country, reeling from the effects of war.
The footage that you'll see is the parading that went on at the end of the war in Holland. My father said they were greeted as heroes, but the poor people were absolutely starved. They had suffered very badly, would sell themselves for a crust of bread. One of the jobs my father had to do was ferry German prisoners out, and you'll see them on board there, because he was rather anxious at the time because he said there he'd got a shipload of 500 Nazi soldiers, and he, with 10 crew and 2 officers, could have easily been rushed had they had a mind to do so. But presumably they were just so glad to get out of the fighting. They could see the way the war had gone, they were finished, and they were just glad to be out of it.
Leslie Fowler was one of the lucky ones who made it home. Without the ingenuity of amateur filmmakers like him who survived, but also those who did not, we would never have been able to see the war with such startling intimacy. Their films show us life on the front lines in a way that newsreels of the era could never match. One of those filmmakers, Derek Brown, remained stationed in the Far East despite victory in Europe. The war with Japan continued, and Brown had stayed in India. Having become engaged in 1942, he hadn't seen his fiancée at all in the following 3 years. For men like Derek, an end to the war seemed a distant prospect.
Most of us were under the impression that we would never get home. As far as we could see, it looked as if we would be fighting our way through the Far East for the rest of our lives. One morning, I saw a newspaper, and it was the description of what had happened at Hiroshima. And my immediate reaction was, well, if they have got a bomb that does a thing like this, we will eventually get home. I remember as we were coming back from the ship on disembarkation, there was one fellow whose fiancée had come to meet him, I think, at the ship. And he said to me afterwards that he was wondering whether she was still the right girl for him. 3 or 4 years apart had made a big difference to him, but not to me, not to either of us.
Is it a sin? Is it a crime? Loving you, dear, like I do? If it's a crime, then I'm guilty of loving you. Maybe I'm wrong, dreaming of you, dreaming the lonely night through. If it's a crime, then I'm guilty of dreaming of you.